We are at noon, so we're gonna get started. We'll probably have some people trickle in, as has been our tradition. Today we have a wonderful presenter. I always talk about next week first. I will put on your radar. Oh, hi everyone. I'm Don Saucer. Just to Faculty Associate Director, Teaching Learning Center. I always forget to introduce myself. You found the TLC Professional Development Series. Wednesdays at noon. We're here. We're on Zoom. We archive our events. So this is one of the need to know events. If you're trying to get a professional development certificate or be a TLC fellow, which you should, and we just dropped the information in the chat. One of my colleagues was nice enough to do that. But if one of your colleagues needs to see this, they'll be able to see it as soon as you upload it when it's done downloading after this. So this is going to be a big one. This is going to be an awesome one. Next week, we got a teaching chat. So next week, you can bring questions, you can bring concerns, you can bring comments that you're kind of facing. I always have some issues that I want to talk about. But next week, it's kind of a little bit more of a free-for-all, and it might be some residual from some of the conversation that we have today. I might intrude into next week's teaching chat as well. But today, without further ado, we have Dr. Camilla Roberts. Dr. Camilla Roberts is part of our honor and integrity system, and will be talking to us about academic integrity post-COVID. And I'm so excited that you're here, Camilla. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If y'all can let me know that you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. All right. Well, like Don said, we're not going forward yet. I'm Camilla Roberts. I am the director of the honor and integrity system here. And there's been a lot of talk recently, definitely with academic integrity. And I'm going to throw this out there right now with artificial intelligence. I am going to hit on that a little bit. Don and I had a short little discussion at the beginning, and so you'll realize hopefully at the end why I don't spend a whole lot of time on it. But I would be interested in questions or thoughts and concerns you might have, since that's kind of the new topic with the chat GPT. But today I really want to look and some of the things that I did. Actually, I've got a book chapter that is in the process of being edited right now about this, about academic integrity post-COVID, and trying to figure out what have we learned, because I think that's the thing that for all of us in academics have had to really try to focus on of, okay, we had COVID, it's there. I wouldn't say we're probably not. We are definitely not to where we were pre-COVID. And I would argue that we're probably never getting there again. And so we have to really look and see, okay, what happened? What happened in our curriculums? What happened? And so for me, what happened in academic integrity during COVID? And what can we take from that? What lessons can we learn from that to be able to move forward? Because some things are always going to be this way, or things have already changed, and maybe they changed for the good or changed for the bad, but we have to take it for what it is, and how are we going to work with it? So I'm going to try to frame it a little bit, though, in terms of student development. So for those who don't know, my background is in student development. My master's is in counseling education, and then a higher ed or a PhD in higher ed administration. And so I really have looked a lot at that student development. I think it's a good framework for us to look at a lot of what our students are, to see them as a holistic body. And I think that I always come to these sessions and I'm like, oh yeah, this will be good for them. But many of you, if you're coming to these sessions, if you're wanting to enhance your teaching, if you're wanting to enhance the experience that your students are getting, these are some of the thoughts that you're probably already having, because you do see the student as a holistic person. You realize that they are not just in your biology class because they love biology. Nope, they're in your biology class because it's a required class and they have to take it. And so, so hopefully you'll be able to share this with some of your colleagues who may not have some of those same feelings. That's my goal, especially. So today's agenda, we are going to take a look at student decision-making and development, especially in terms of COVID and what happened during the pandemic, of why students cheat. And I've covered some of these things in the past about why students cheat, but again, I'm putting that little spin of what did we see during the pandemic. The student development, I think this is definitely a key aspect of where our students were and where their development was, how it affected what they did or didn't do during the pandemic. And then looking at why students don't cheat. So we'll look at the positive. What can we do in that community building, especially in terms of what we've learned to help our students in the future. We're going to look a little bit about assessing students. So with the assessments, I am not one who to create assessments, but definitely this is something that academic integrity folks have really been looking at over the past 2 years. And the International Center for Academic Integrity actually put on several webinars about different types of assessments, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic, but has continued on because we do have quite a few institutions that are 100% online. They're like, we've been doing this for years without any proctoring or things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about what we've learned from the pandemic and assessing students. We will definitely get into technology, various aspects, but that's where I'll talk a little bit about the Chat GPT. And then what can we do with this knowledge? What can you do, especially in your classroom, if we look back at what we've learned from our time in the pandemic? So I will try to monitor the chat a little bit, but it's a little difficult, sharing the screen. We've all been through that. But then we will definitely have time for some questions at the end. So really, to begin a discussion about our students' decision-making and development, we really have to figure out why students might even be thinking about making these decisions. And so knowing why these students might even cheat initially can give us some insight about what happened during the pandemic and again, what we can learn from it. So the first reason why students might cheat or be academically dishonest is because there's opportunities to do so. And if you think about pre-pandemic times, if they're especially students who are face-to-face students, some of these opportunities might have been a large lecture class with minimal proctors, access to old exams in student organizations, or access to other students. Now, a lot of that stuff is still available even through the pandemic, but the pandemic then opened the doors for other opportunities, especially one centered around technology, and we'll talk more about that, that were never accessible to students before, and those opportunities led some students to choose to be academically dishonest. Students may also be academically dishonest when they're under pressure or stress. Now, there was a survey done by the Mayo Foundation for Medical Education and Research in 2001 that said it did show a drastic increase. I'm going to read this: an increase of reports of stress, anxiety, insomnia, and depression from a survey of adults in the United States during that pandemic time. We all experienced that, and our college students, our students were no different. They had various different kinds of stress or pressure. And so on top of their academic pressure. And so having that additional pressure and stress could have caused students to choose to violate the honor pledge, choose to be academically dishonest, including maybe looking at unauthorized sources just to ease their stress. They didn't want to spend much time doing the work, or using some kind of unauthorized aid. The third reason why we see that students might cheat is the student doesn't feel a connection to the class. Sometimes they think that the class might be trivial or irrelevant. This is oftentimes the case when it's that class is just a required course. But especially during the pandemic, we saw this even more so, that our students lost that connection with the course because they lost the connection with the professor. They lost the connections with their peers in the class. And some of the courses, unfortunately, made it, and I wouldn't necessarily put it on the professors, but the students perceived that course was just a check mark that they had to get through. It was not about the learning. It was just, you just need to get this course completed. Now, K-State was one of the institutions that did change it to a pass-fail in order to somewhat help the students in case they were struggling, that they wouldn't be harmed by the GPA if they made a C because of the extra pressure and stress. But I would argue that kind of put a little bit idea that the students, to the students, that we just need to get through this class. It's a pass-fail class. Just get it done. A C is good enough, and they might not have tried their hardest. It's the same kind of mentality when I talk with professors when they're having a case come through our system about sanctioning. That if they say, I'm going to give them a cap of a grade of a B in the class. Well, if they already have a C or a B and you're just capping the grade, Is that really encouraging them to continue and excel? Maybe not. Maybe it's you give them a 0 on the exam, but they could still make an A. If they really work their tail off and they do really well, they can still be successful in the class, rather than just saying, well, I've already got that, I might as well stop now. Because I know there are probably, and you probably had some students, if you taught during that time period, that pass fail option, that they're like, well, I can pass without even taking the final exam. Well, I can pass without doing this. They just chose not to do it. And then they missed that learning opportunity. If we really truly believe the assessments are learning opportunities, they've missed that learning opportunity. The fourth one is that idea of fairness and others doing it. And I'll talk more about this as well, but we definitely saw this in a lot of interviews that were done with students during the pandemic, and even my own personal experiences in talking with students that had violations. Like, if I want to stay up and stay consistent with the students that I'm my peers, I have to do the same thing they do. My professor's grading on a curve, then I have to make sure I'm one of the top people as well. So others are doing it, so I should be doing it too. The next one is why students cheat is they perceive that the class reinforces extrinsic, not intrinsic goals. And this goes kind of directly back to that no connection to the course. But it's the idea of that they don't see a value in the class. They don't see the reason why they have to learn that material. And especially during the time of COVID, especially when we think about the spring semester of 2020, goals for the class were set out in January. In March, we went remote. Those goals definitely changed and may not have even been hit whatsoever. And some of them were not able to be adjusted to the online environment because they weren't designed for that online environment to start with. They were designed for that face-to-face. And so the student's perception was, again, I don't care about you learning this material. We just need to get through as much as we can. And we have to mark that checkbox to make sure we're through that class. And then the final reason why students may be academically dishonest is they're not really sure what constitutes cheating, or they don't think they would be caught. Now, many of our students thought that being hidden behind a computer screen gave them anonymity. I think several of them quickly learned that that is not accurate, that through our Canvas or any other learning management software that other institutions use, that information is tracked. They are not anonymous. At that point in time, Chegg, for instance, was working with us to be able to give us information. They were not anonymous in who viewed Chegg, who posted to Chegg. So it's that metadata was very important, but also the idea of they weren't sure what constituted cheating. That's something that we'll talk more about on the faculty side and the instructor side, of making sure we share with our students what does it mean to be academically honest and academically dishonest in the class. So if we look at these real 6 reasons, we see why students might have cheated. And these are the same reasons that were before pre-pandemic as well, but they were just enhanced and seen in different ways during that pandemic. So if we look a little bit and turn our attention, there we go, turn our attention a little bit to the student development side. As we mentioned earlier, our students and our stress and anxiety was higher. And sometimes that stress and anxiety does cause us to make poor choices. There's always the saying that you should never make a major life decision when you're upset, when you're emotional. You need to make sure you're calmed down. That's the same idea, that if our students are having to do things when they're under a high level of stress, they might make poor choices and not use the same skills that they normally have. So if we look at our students and their development, some of our students made great choices. Some of them were at a developmental level and had support to maybe at home, maybe had connections with and maintained connections, even while they might not have been on campus as much. But others, if they didn't have that support, their growth was really stunted. And so Aston is a very popular and one of the easiest theories of student development that we can really think of, but it's a theory of challenge and support, that basically if we want our students to grow, we need to challenge them, but then we need to support them as well. They say that stress, again, can diminish that growth. And so for some of our students, there was definitely the challenge. And if they did not get that support, even though, I mean, TLC did the information, had a lot of stuff, the provost put out a lot of information, we were trying to support those students, but we know that didn't always happen. And so when they were, when those challenges were not supported, the growth and that motivation of that student fell. And then that sometimes might have led to them making poor decisions. Now, another theory is Perry's theory of intellectual and ethical development. And if we think about this, it is the idea of making decisions in an ethical way. And how do you make those decisions? And so if we think about our first year students, those first year students, and this is traditionally a linear model, but you see that it can change somewhat. Sometimes those first year students are coming in and they're a very dualistic thinker. They're looking at a received knowledge. They want the teacher to give you that information. They might not be expected or may not do well with actually debating things. They might not do well with take all this information and kind of figure out what similarities there are, what differences there are. Some of them can do that, but some of them just, they want to take those multiple choice tests. They want to be told exactly what they're supposed to know. But as students start to see a little bit more ambiguity, they're able to move and transition to that multiplicity, that they realize that knowledge is kind of subjective, that we have to figure out for themselves what's really important. And this continues on through that graduate level, where they're able to realize that I have to construct my own knowledge. But what we see, and Perry saw this as well, that when students are under stress, they start going backwards in this linear model. They start to realize, I want somebody to tell me what to do. It's very similar to our lives sometimes. If we're in a very stressful time and you don't know what to do, I mean, I can even think about it as a parent. Things are going on with kids, it's all these questions, and I'm like, I just want somebody to tell me what I should do. Just tell me the answer. Don't make me try to figure it out myself. Just tell me the answer and I'll be happy with it. And so that's the same thing. When we're under stress, sometimes we do resort back to that dualistic thinking that I don't want to have to figure it out myself. And so this was very difficult for some of our students, because if we think it's combining these theories, if they weren't getting the support, yet they were resorting back to this dualistic thinking, they just needed to know what to do. And when they didn't feel like they were getting that information from faculty, from their classmates, from other people. And so it caused them to seek out other ways to get that answer, because they weren't trying to construct their own knowledge. They just needed to know the answer at that point in time. And then the final theory that I want to cover is, again, kind of a very monumental theory in student development, Chickering and Reiser's 7 vectors of student development. And for all of these, Chickering and Reiser say that they normally do start from top and work down to the bottom. But again, you can be working on these different vectors and different parts of your life as you're going along. But if we look at even developing competence, this was a very difficult thing for some of our students to do. They couldn't develop the basic competence of a course if they weren't getting the support. They didn't know where to get it. They weren't being told what they were expected of, or those expectations changed very suddenly. And for many of our students, they changed for multiple semesters. So we had March of 2020, they changed from what it was in January. Then they went back in the fall of 2020. And this was, okay, we might come back to class. We might have some in class, we might be in online some, and you have to be really flexible. That was always, we have to be flexible. We have to give people grace, which is perfectly fine, but our students weren't given always the exact expectations, and they weren't able to develop those competence. When we're under stress, our emotions run high, and our students were expected to try to manage those emotions. It was very difficult for them. If this is something that they're supposed to be trying to develop at this time, and we put them under so much stress, say, hey, this is what I really want you to do, and we're going to make it even harder for you because we're going to throw you into this situation. And so it kind of goes through that Chickering and Reiser said that these students need to be able to have at least those first 6 vectors done before they start developing that integrity. So that makes sense that if our students weren't able to manage their emotions, if they weren't having good interpersonal relationships, which many of them might not have had that, having to move back home with their parents, if they had identified as, I'm a college student, I am part of this organization, that I'm a student athlete, those were their identity, and those identities were stripped away from them during the pandemic. And so that really then affected, how are they going to be able to develop their integrity and be who they say they really want to be when all these other aspects of their life were up in the air. And so it was nearly impossible for us to assume that our students could develop the integrity. And so that leads us as, well, if our students weren't able to develop then, or they had struggles, then now we're picking up the pieces. Now we're trying to figure out, how can we meet our students where they're at, to be able to help them develop as an individual, but then that'll also help them develop and make good ethical decisions. So if we look at why students don't cheat, I think this is important to look at, because we see why students did cheat, especially during the pandemic, and we'll see this a little bit even in these examples, but this helps us build community and build for the future. So the first reason why students don't cheat is that the norm on campus is not to cheat. However, I did mention that's why sometimes students do cheat, because not necessarily the norm, but it's because everybody else is doing it, the fairness. And so during that pandemic, students thought that they had to be like everybody else, or at least they assumed other people were cheating. Than it was. There was a survey done in 2001 and found that of those surveyed, of the students surveyed, and I did not write down how many, I'm sorry, nearly 81% of those surveyed thought more cheating was occurring during their online classes during the pandemic. And so the students were seeing it, and so then it was not the norm. So now it's time for us to figure out, how can we create the norm on campus is to not cheat. It is to be academically honest. Another reason why some students choose not to be academically dishonest is there are consequences to it, and there's a high probability of being caught. But what that means is that our faculty and our instructors and staff, we need to make sure we're telling students that, listen, we do have an honor pledge. These are the ways that you could be sent to the honor code, sent to the honor and integrity system. I know many professors, they're nervous about filing an honor and integrity system violation because they don't want to ruin the student's life. They don't want to hurt their feelings, whatever it might be. But I can guarantee there are definitely some professors, and some, I'll go even beyond that, some departments and some even colleges that have more of a reputation of filing. And I think that those students know that. And so they're a little bit more cautious. They know that, oh, I'm definitely not going to do anything in that person's class because I've heard stories. My office does not share that. That is, students are sharing that, but that becomes their perception. But it does, to a certain degree, help our students realize that, wow, this professor, they're going to be checking. They're going to be looking, not necessarily just to catch somebody, but they're going to make sure that I'm learning that material. And then the last one is that some students, a good number of students, I know that I talk about all these students who cheat, but a good number of students are very committed to learning. However, I think that the pandemic just enlarged that gap between those students who are really committed to learning and the students who just wanted to check the box and say, I just need this degree, or I just need this class for my degree. And so we have to then go back to the idea of how do we make sure that our students are understanding the importance of the class, especially if it's a class that is not necessarily required for them other than an elective or a social science or something like that, but they're still committed to learning that material and learning it as just to be a better person. They can use some of the skills that they're learning in the class, maybe not the exact topics all the time, but they can still get something out of that class. So how does knowing this really help us? So if we reflect on that development of the student, and so now I'll say that, and you'll hear this in student affairs a lot, that we meet students where they are. But I'm not saying that you have to do a personalized learning plan for every single student. Now that is, as with, I've got 2 children, one in middle school and one in elementary school, and that is the big discussion in the K-12 schools of student-centered learning, the idea of that tailored learning plans for every single one of your students. And I can guarantee some of the faculty members in those classes that teach 150 students are thinking, absolutely not, I can't do that. I have to do Scantron tests already because there's no way I can even grade all those. So I'm not saying that you have to do individualized learning for every student, but being aware of those, the differences in our students, and maybe allowing that knowledge help you develop your assessments, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. So also making sure we're challenging and supporting the student. Since we know that if we want to challenge those students, we have to support them in that same regard. So if you know that you're going to be holding a student accountable for something in terms of, let's say, APA style of citation, well, give them the tools to learn how to use APA style of citation. Take the time in your class to go over it. Make sure those things are available. It's not going to save every plagiarism case. It's not going to stop everything, but at least you're supporting those students, especially those who want to learn. You're allowing them to continue on and take that challenge and become better because of it. And then I think a big thing is the idea of building community. And like I said earlier, previous slide, that if we want the norm to be a culture of integrity, we want the norm to be we're not cheating, we all have to be involved in it. And so we have to build that community of integrity. And so some of that is looking at our classroom expectations. And I would encourage you to work with your students to build those. What is expected of them in the class? How do you expect them to act in the class? How do you expect them to answer questions? How do you expect them to come to class prepared, so that they will know they're a part of it? When students are a part of those decision-making conversations, they're more likely to follow through with it. But also it's that sharing of institutional expectations. You all, again, since you're here at this, I know that you're rule followers probably, and so you all have that paragraph about the honor and integrity system in your syllabus. And that's very important, but also share with your students, what does it mean to have an honor and integrity system as an institution? Why does it really even matter? Bring it back to your classroom to make sure that they're understanding that you're preparing them for their career. And why does integrity matter in their career? You probably have some sort of community standards within your profession, or some ethical guidelines, things like that you can look at and build from and share with your students, and saying, listen, this isn't just at the time while you're at K-State. This is for a longer term. We're trying to make people of integrity. We're trying to make sure that you can be as the K-State is always saying, that we want to build citizens. We want good citizens to graduate from K-State. We don't say we want people who keep picking on biology, but we don't necessarily say we want students who really know their biology backwards and forwards. We want good citizens. We want that well-rounded individual. And all of us can help with that. And I think that's the idea of that, building that community. I think it's also, and I've had some conversations, and it's interesting that we actually, our keynote for our upcoming conference is going to be talking about this, and for the International Center for Academic Integrity, of the connection between the building of community in terms of helping us create a culture of integrity is a very similar type of community that we try to make sure that all of our students feel accepted when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, making sure that people feel comfortable, they feel like they can have a voice without being judged, without being necessarily critiqued. Because if a student has that level of not just comfort, but level of investment in the class, they're less likely to have that honor and integrity violation. And then you're also teaching those life skills to help them become that better citizen. So it's really been interesting over the past probably 6 months, a year, as I've been working with our keynote speaker and having these conversations about, there is a lot of overlap for the work that we're doing to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion within our classroom environments, that is really could help and be beneficial in decreasing the amount of academic integrity concerns or increasing that just culture of integrity. So switching gears a little bit, since we talked a little bit about that student development, but now more of what you might be interested in, especially if you're in the classroom, but in looking at assessments. And since assessments are necessary in some regards, I mean, we have to figure out, have our students successfully learned, or do they understand the material that I was trying to get relayed to them? Some of these assessments are required to be able to move on to the next course. You might be preparing students to take an assessment for a licensure exam. So assessment is very important, and this has really been a major topic since the pandemic started in terms of academic integrity, because in most cases, academic misconduct occurs on assessments. And so we really need to partner with folks like you all, or many of you who are in the classroom, to figure out how can we better assess our students, or how can we relook at our assessments so that we might deter misconduct. So I think it's really important to remember how the types of assessments can be related to that student development. So if we think back to that linear model, that dualistic thinking versus relativistic versus multiplicity and that constructive knowledge, some of our students are not quite ready to be constructing their own knowledge. So if you're teaching a lower level class, maybe you are able to challenge them a little bit and have some of those those essays where they have to construct their own knowledge. But they're also a lot of times expecting and do best on some of that true, false, multiple choice, that dualistic thinking. And so if a student is that dualistic thinker and they're given that assessment that is really looking for them to construct their own knowledge, that causes the stress. Could cause a student to choose other ways to get help that are not allowed during that assessment. So again, it's not a requirement whatsoever, and you can definitely do that challenge in supporting the student. But I think for many of these situations, if you're going to be assessing in a certain way, if you're going to be assessing them by having to construct their knowledge, hopefully during that time period before in the classroom, you've been practicing that. Maybe it's through classroom conversation, you're having them construct that knowledge. So it's not a brand new thing when they're actually coming to the test. So for instance, I'm teaching a grad level class right now, and it's a group of second years. All of them are second year grad students. They're be taking their comprehensive exams. The class that I teach is actually as one of the comprehensive exam questions for them. And so I'm able to tailor the way I'm teaching the class, and we're almost practicing what they're going to be required to do on their comprehensive exam on almost every single week, because it's different topics, but they're getting the idea of mentally thinking, how am I supposed to analyze these various articles to get to this point? So hopefully my goal for them is that assessment is not going to be something new to them, and I hope develop them through the semester prior to that comprehensive exam. When we are assessing our students, we have to also understand group projects and collaboration. Now, this is something we definitely looked at and have learned a lot since the pandemic, because we've realized that being apart doesn't stop us from working together. A lot of our students, especially during that spring of 2020, they're like, well, we can't have group projects anymore. And some of them might not have been able to. Some of them truly, because of timing, because of internet capabilities, they might not have been able to have those group projects. But in many cases now, as we come back to more hybrid or more in person or even online, they understand they can have group projects, but it's again, we have to make sure we're explaining to them to what extent does this group project count for your grade? To what extent can each person work on it? Does one person need to do it all? Hopefully not if it's a group project. To what level of collaboration do you want to see? And if it's not a group project, is collaboration allowed whatsoever? And I think that these things are all things that need to be thought about ahead of time from the faculty perspective, to be able to put that information into an assignment guidelines, just so that students know up front that I'm going to have to judge my group teammates. I'm going to have to grade them, and all students may or may not get the same grade. They need to know this ahead of time so that they're able to make their best choice of maybe picking their groups that they want to work with, or maybe if it's an assigned group from you all, then they're still able to say, listen, we're all going to be graded on this. We're all going to have to grade each other, and we need to make sure that it's an even representation of everybody. Probably one of the biggest things that we learned through the pandemic, or we questioned at least, was the need for assessments. And really thinking about how many assessments do we really need? Do we need an assessment for every single thing? Do we need those points? And we also saw that it's, and a lot of research has backed this up, that it is better for our students in terms of their stress, and they do better to have lower stake assessments. There was research done in 2021 by Hessel as the lead author, and they examined a correlation between high stake assessments, a student's cortisol level, and the result on the assessments. And this is what they found. Quote, high stakes testing is related to cortisol responses, and those responses are related to test performance. This was interesting. Those who responded most strongly with either increases or decreases in cortisol scored 0.4 standard deviations lower than expected on the high stake exams. So those individuals, there was a physical component to their body when they were presented with a very high stake assessment. So that final exam and midterm being the only assessment guidelines. And though that physical component actually led to a 4 standard deviations lower than what they had expected to actually make on the assessment. So that's telling us that goes directly back to our stress and pressure leads some of our students to not do as well, or to take some shortcuts or make some decisions they might not have normally done. And so I think this is for us, we can definitely take this after post-COVID to say, really revamp, how are we assessing our students? How are we, instead of maybe asking ourselves, well, how can we make sure that they know the material, but how can we make sure they've mastered that material? How can they truly understand that information and not just be able to memorize it and regurgitate it back to us? Also with assessing students, what we've learned through the pandemic is communication is very important. This is what a lot of students said, complained about, that they didn't hear from professors. Professors also heard we didn't hear from our students. So it's a two-way streak. That communication is key. And when we're talking about assessment, of making sure we are communicating to our students how they're going to be assessed, not really hiding things from them, because we want them to be successful. And so if we can set them up for success, that's going to help them. Not giving them the answers, but we can all think back to times when we were all in those classes, and it is stressful if you don't even know what type of test you're going into. Is this going to be a multiple choice test? Is it going to be an essay test? Is it going to be a combination? That just adds extra stress. You're not worried about the stuff and the material you're learning. You're trying to figure out, oh my goodness, how should I prepare for this test? Because I don't even know what the professor's expecting. Am I going to have an hour to take this? Am I going to have 15 minutes to take this? All that communication is very important, because that lack of communication, again, increases that stress of our students and could lead them to make those poor decisions. So those various types of assessments are also important. It's something we've also learned, that it doesn't necessarily always have to be a test. that it doesn't necessarily always have to be a paper. And we'll talk about this again with that Chat GPT, that Chat GPT can only go so far. And so if we are open to different types of assessments and looking at ways and really branching out from what you might have done for the past 3 semesters or 3 years or 30 years, then maybe we're able to be able to see a little bit more of that the students have mastered that subject. Now, again, I know there's probably questions from especially some of our STEM fields of like, well, how else am I supposed to get them to understand or get them to show me that they know I'll say the quadratic formula. Hopefully they know that by the time they're in college, but there are still ways that they can explain the background, they can write about it. They can, even again, go back to my daughter, and she's having to write out for math, the definition. She has to show an example of it. She has to do different things rather than just doing the problems. Yes, she has to do some problems that they're doing, products and all this different things, but she then has to do a word board. So turning that math and that STEM into words that the student is able to then explain what does it mean to them and putting it into their own words. So it's important to think about those various types of assessments because we're seeing that our students are very different. And those different types of assessments and also low stake assessments are very important for our students. This kind of goes directly, since assessing the students, a lot of our assessments dealt directly with technology and especially or the violations with our assessments. And so switching a little bit to technology. I'm sure all of you have heard about Chegg. This was definitely one of the main forms of technology used in terms of during the pandemic, but it's allowed us to really think about how are we using it now versus how are we teaching our students about it. I think that it's definitely can be said now that Chegg is not something that our students do not know about. I know several years ago I would mention Chegg in presentations, and our professors like, don't mention that, it might give them an idea. No, our students know what Chegg is. They know about these other sites as well. But there was some research done in 2021 by a professor out of London, Thomas Lancaster, and some of his colleagues. And he was able to show that, quote, the number of student requests posted for 5 subjects that they looked at increased by 196.25% compared with the time period of April 2019 to August 2019, with the period of April 2020 to August 2020. So basically, during that April 2020 to August 2020, there were 196.5% more questions posted on Chegg. Now, that doesn't necessarily say that was many cheating, and that's what when you talk to Chegg, that's what they will say. It's like we were a useful tool, and there are probably some students that used it as a tool, but many of our students did use it as just copying. If you watched in the news through 2020, 2021, Chegg was constantly in it. Forbes magazine interviewed 52 students who used Chegg. And they said, aside from half a dozen students that Chegg provided for Forbes to talk to, so Chegg provided 6 students, then Forbes found the other 46 students, all but 4 admitted that they used the site to cheat. And then these included undergraduates and graduate students from 19 colleges, including small and large and small state schools and prestigious private universities like Columbia, Brown, Duke, and NYU. So students all over were using Chegg. But what can we learn from this is that it's okay to talk about it. We've had even since we've come back on campus, and even that first fall semester of 2020, more professors are having some sort of statement in their syllabus saying you should not be going to these homework help sites. Some professors list out exact names. there is somewhat of a concern with that because there's new sites every day. I mean, the students will come back, well, I didn't know, you didn't say that exact site. You can always say those sites and others like it. Again, our students have to use some common sense, but if they're choosing to go to some of these sites, they might have already lost their common sense for a little while. A second form of technology that definitely was used for academic misconduct, again, that I think that when I share it in my presentations with students, some of them are surprised, but some of them are not. But if you go to YouTube and just search for how to cheat, you're going to get a lot of things on how to cheat on a spouse or a partner, but you're also going to get a lot of things, especially in the past 2 years, on how to cheat on an exam. And especially during how to cheat on online exams. There's one YouTuber named That One Muhammad, and this was probably about a couple months ago, had 8.68 thousand subscribers and 11 videos on how to cheat, but his videos have been viewed over 2 million times. And so these are some of the quotes that were after the video. And somebody said, colleges are making us pay thousands for us to teach ourselves schoolwork in our rooms. This man is doing God's work, talking about the YouTube creator. Another person said, I'm not cheating, I'm finding a way to get out of my exam. And so there's various different sites on YouTube that are teaching our students how to cheat and how to get past proctoring systems. And so I'm not going to go into much things about proctoring systems right now, but there's a lot of debate whether they're necessary. Can students beat the proctoring system, whether it's worth the cost? Again, we can have more conversation about that later on. Another form of technology that is kind of popped up around the pandemic, but that's also just because I think partially it was just a newer technology. I mean, there were definitely group chats previously, but it definitely was more involved during that pandemic for students to be able to stay connected, was the creation of group chats. I actually talked with a professor earlier this semester about should group chats even be allowed in the classroom? Not necessarily in the classroom, but for the class. And there's really nothing that can stop that. And group chats can be very beneficial to your students because your students can use each other as another resource of even, hey, do we have an assignment due? Or we need to get together and we're having a study group. So these group chats are very beneficial. But what I'm telling students now is that if you are part of a group chat and you see anything that's going on that you think that might be considered part of a violation, if you're seeing somebody ask for questions, if the group chat's going on during an exam, then that student needs to come and talk to the professor. I told them that's pretty much the only way that student probably will not be held accountable in terms of a violation if they're the ones that actually report it. Now, just to give you the information about our previous cases with group chats, most of the time it is the students who have actively engaged in that chat at that time period, because there might be 50 people in this group chat, but there were 10 that actually asked questions, responded to questions and actually wrote an answer or showed some emotion, like they liked it, they put the heart sign, did something like that. So they were actively involved in that chat function during that time period. So in most cases, everybody else, they might have seen it, but if they didn't actively engage in it, it's hard to hold those students accountable. But that was definitely something we saw, that students were using those group chats during exams. They were using group chats to say, hey, here's a Zoom link. Let's set up a Zoom link and on our other device while we're in the class or in the online exam on our computer. And these group chats can continue on even in an in-person class if we're not cautious about making sure that phones are not allowed and the like. But they're using that technology to be able to get support where they really should not have. And then the idea of artificial intelligence, and this is not necessarily something we've learned from COVID, but it's definitely academic integrity post-COVID. And so that is that Chat GPT. For those of you who have not heard of Chat GPT, it is created by open AI, so an open artificial intelligence program that's actually been backed by Microsoft. And basically if you watch any of the videos of it and the conversations about it, it will say that it's better than Google, that you can pretty much get anything you want. And it'll kind of take over what we now know as the search engine of trying to get information. But what the concern is, in terms of academic integrity, is that ChatGPT can provide some pretty well written essays or information. And so here's a couple examples that you can see. And so this is one that one of my colleagues shared with me that she did, that in ChatGPT, she put the quote of write 50 words with APA citations from at least 3 academic journals explaining when plagiarism is justified, make the language appropriate to a graduate course in business, provide an APA formatted reference list. And so you can see that ChatGPT within 30 seconds provided, according to the role of attribution in ethical business practice, citation, plagiarism can be justifiable in certain circumstances, such as in the case of paraphrasing and patch writing, where ideas are built upon and expanded upon, giving credit to the original source. Additionally, in quote, when is plagiarism acceptable in academic research, the author argues that self-plagiarism, and you can continue on. It is a pretty good 50-word article. It has the citations. There was just on the Today Show this morning that and it came out, I think it was yesterday, that they've used ChatGPT to do all the assignments for a law school, and law school professors then graded those, and that ChatGPT would have made a C+ throughout most of these law school exams. So there's some concern there, but what does this mean for us? And why from the very beginning, when I said I wasn't going to be talking a lot about ChatGPT, is because it's not necessarily that we have to stop it. I think it's how are we going to adjust in terms of our assessments? How do we make them more personalized? And so yesterday, a couple of days ago, I put in this, and this is actually because there was a case many years ago that a student, it was in the natural disasters class, basically had to write a discussion board post summarizing something, how a natural disaster affected you or your family member or you knew or a common person. And so as the professor in that situation was reading through, they read how one individual read about how this natural disaster affected them. And then a couple paragraphs down, like a couple of posts down, they start reading and they're like, I've just read this before. And so we had 2 students who wrote the exact same information. Well, professor thought that the person who wrote it second, who was like a few hours later, must have copied the person 3 posts above. And professor was like, how in the world did they not think I was going to read this? Well, bring the students in. It ended up that they had actually copied from a blog. They had spent a lot of time searching for somebody online who might have written about how a natural disaster affected their life. And then they both copied from the exact same blog and put in the discussion board. So I was like, okay, that was a pretty good assessment because it brings it back very personal to the individual. And so I wanted to know, how did ChatGPT manage that? And so I said, write a 50-word summary of how a natural disaster affected you or your family. And the reply was, I'm an AI. I do not have family and I'm not affected by natural disasters. So this gave me that idea that, we can be smarter than AI. We can be smarter than ChatGPT, but it's all about if we want to take the time to change our assessments and to change them and personalize them in a way that they can't just put this information in there, or make a twist a little bit that they have to include certain things that would be more difficult for ChatGPT to do. There's no way we're going to stop it. And that's where I'm at right now, that it's going to be there. It's going to be something, but in terms of academic integrity and in terms of my colleagues working with academic integrity, this artificial intelligence it's just one more thing. It's just the newest thing. And so that's why from our field, I don't think it's been talked about quite as much as it is in the design of courses and the assessment side of the coin. So ChatGPT, I think it just is teaching us that, again, we really have to think outside the box of how are we having our students show the mastery of the subject to us as a professor. So to finish up, I've just got, a lot of these things I've covered already, but go through pretty quickly of, again, some of the highlights of post-COVID, what have we learned? So now what can we do? So one, the assessment styles might differ for our first year students versus graduate students, remembering that dualistic thinking, multiplicity versus constructing their own knowledge. If you're going to do assessments for teams versus individuals, how do they work together? Should the teams be a part of the grade? Do they actually grade their teammates? Things you can do is building that community. If we have that community, it's that level of integrity, that culture of integrity in your classroom, sharing those rules and policies and regulations. We can always continue to reiterate things, not hand-holding, but working with our students, encouraging them and reminding them, listen, I'm going to hold you accountable for this, and also and setting them up for success, reminding them that, listen, remember, you have a major paper due in 2 weeks. Don't wait until the day before to say, hey, hope you remember that paper. I mentioned it in my first day of class. It's not trying to test them of, did they read the syllabus? Are they a good person in terms of time management, but working with our students and helping them through. Understanding that authentic learning, what do you really need to assess? How are they showing you their mastery of the subject? And lower stake assessments if at all possible. Give them a voice, help them build that community, help them build the community of the classroom, and then help find the source of motivation. Allow them to maybe decide some of the topics. That's also another way that could help you avoid some of this ChatGPT of making them part of developing their own assessment. And then talk to them about your class and why integrity is important. That's helping them behind motivation in the class and finding that value, that intrinsic value of, even though this class is not something that I would have ever taken, I'm learning something from it. I found some information. I made good connections with the professor, helping them find that motivation. And then adapting teaching and assessments. We talked about that in terms of different learning styles. Giving them examples of what is good, mediocre, and poor work, providing that rubric rather than just saying you got a 63 on it, but not giving them any feedback. Again, I think I'm preaching to the choir, especially for those people who are here for that, about make sure you give feedback and then hold them accountable. Our students need to know that you are going to hold them accountable. And if they do feel like they're going to be held accountable, they're less likely going to try to do something inappropriate. So my conclusions are academic misconduct is not going to be eliminated. It's not going to be. Mainly, I want job security for me. I mean, that's kind of part of it, but it's not going to be eliminated, but it can be minimized, lessened, or reduced. And these new challenges are continuing to evolve. That ChatGPT, 6 months, there'll be something else. Education and awareness are key, and it's really focusing on the prevention of misconduct. And I'll throw this out there that unfortunately, a lot of my job is having to right now take care of the misconduct, and I don't have as much time in the prevention that I would like to have. So I'm really relying on our faculty to have that prevention, that focus on prevention. And it can be frustrating, especially when you're trying to grade things. It's extra work. You have to submit something. But if you're going to help build that culture of integrity, you have to have the courage to do what's right, addressing with the student, following up with my office, and the like. And I know I am right at time. I did not really give a lot of time for questions, so I apologize for that. Oh, somebody saying the ChatGPT was more than 50 words. I did not count the words, but are there any quick questions or things? I'm happy to chat with other people offline if you want to email me. I didn't put my email address, but it's cjroberts at ksu.edu, or you can contact me at honor@ksu.edu. So I'm happy to touch base with anybody. I did know that we had a few people, I think they've had to leave. We had a couple of people from the Honor Council that were actually on the meeting as well. I'll let Noah answer the question about a recording.
Yeah. Thank you, Kristen. Yes, the recording will be available. It'll take us a couple minutes after this this concludes for us to get the uploaded to be available on our website. And you can definitely share it with any of your colleagues. So thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for that wonderful presentation. That was great. For those of you who attended, if you want to complete a post-event survey, we have that link in the chat. As a reminder, you can earn a fellowship or certificate, and we'll see you next week for our teaching chat. But thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for being here today with us.
Thanks.